Welcome, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. Today, we're diving into something that touches all of us, which is hormonal health. This is how we train. This impacts how we recover, our body composition, our overall health. And we're here with Dr. Carla DiGirolamo, who is a board-certified OBGYN and reproductive endocrinologist. She is also a Menopause Society certified practitioner and named top doctor in the Boston area 2019, 2024, CrossFit Level 1 trainer, certified nutrition coach, group fitness instructor, the pioneer in women's performance endocrinology, and the founder of her private practice where she integrates fitness, nutrition, and medical therapy to help women thrive from puberty all the way to menopause. Dr. Carla, welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you, Chelsea. It's great to be here.
And we did talk with you a few months back, so I just want to make sure that everybody knows that today we're trying to cover more live Q&A. We had more questions come in. We always have so many questions come in our group about hormonal health. So there's a lot of information that will probably be in that original recording, which is available on Spotify as well as YouTube. But to start us off, get us all on the same page, would you mind giving us, please, a brief explanation of what an endocrinologist is and how you help women athletes?
So an endocrinologist in general is a specialist who focuses on hormone health. And there's lots of aspects of hormone health. It could be medical endocrinology, which is like thyroid, adrenal, pituitary gland. And my specialty is reproductive endocrinology. So that specializes in women's hormonal health. There's some male hormonal health there too. I dove into that a bit when I was in the fertility world. And I just kind of briefly touch along the edges, adrenal health and thyroid health and pituitary health. But mainly my focus is the reproductive axis, which encompasses puberty, pregnancy, reproductive hormonal health, as well as menopause.
I love that. That's fantastic. And a lot of times we see questions come up around hormonal health whenever people start to kind of hit a wall. That may be in their training or just in general in their energy, mood changes. In the last episode, you mentioned sleep being a big, possibly being an indicator of hormonal health, or even for our population of competitors, it could be period loss extending beyond their prep. Is that typically what you see for women who are either lifestyle athletes or physique competitors when they come to you? Are they dealing with those things, or are they dealing with other challenges?
There are so many of my clients who are competitive athletes, whether they be physique athletes, endurance athletes, CrossFit athletes. One thing I see incredibly commonly is energy imbalance. And so what that means is they're not consuming enough fuel or the right types of fuel to fuel their activities. And that affects the hormones, affects two very important pathways. The stress hormone response, which is your fight or flight pathway that deals with stress and physical encounters. And that has a direct link to reproductive hormones because they have to do with survival and procreation, which are two driving forces that are the reason why humans have been here for so long. And so I often see when women are not fueling properly, it activates the stress response system, which then affects their hormonal axis in the reproductive realm. So that is an incredibly common thing that I see. And that trickles down into a lot of other things like sleep, mood symptoms, bone health, muscle health, and performance. When things are out of whack or out of line, people's performance suffers because the system is just not in an equilibrium.
Right. And I really appreciate that you do start with how are you fueling yourself? This isn't always something that you're going straight to hormones. And I do want to clarify for everybody too. We learned in the last talk that hormone replacement therapy isn't necessarily the preferred term, which I thought was really fascinating because depending on, I actually, do you mind recapping that, why you prefer not to call it hormone replacement therapy?
Well, when we talk about menopausal hormone therapy, these are women who achieve menopause at the typical age, which is around 51, 52 if you are a Caucasian. It's hormone therapy because you're not replacing anything. To replace something means that you're replacing something that's supposed to be there. In menopause, what menopause is a change in hormonal environment where you're no longer ovulating, your reproductive window has closed, and what that results in is a new normal of hormone, hormone levels. Your estrogen, progesterone is no longer as high as it was. Your FSH, LH from the pituitary gland are higher. So you're reaching a new normal. And this is normal. So you're not replacing anything. But what you are doing with hormones is you are treating symptoms. That's what you're doing in that stage of life. That's why people take hormone therapy, to mitigate symptoms and to help, promote their physical being, not to replace or recreate the hormonal environment of youth. That's impossible. You can't create the multiple layers of regulation of hormonal life when you're 30 by slapping a patch on, or putting an IUD in, or taking a pill.
Right.
You're really treating symptoms. However, it is called hormone replacement therapy when you've got people who are in premature menopause. So these are women whose periods stop for good under the age of 40. In this
Okay.
case, that's not a normal situation. In this case, you are replacing hormones that are supposed to be there at that point. So that's why we call it replacement in that situation, but not in a menopausal woman, because her hormones are supposed to be in this new normal. So that it's
Okay.
a nuance, it's very academic, but it's important, because I think people mistakenly think that they're 55 years old, they're menopausal. If they just take this progesterone, or if they just put on this estrogen patch, it's going to be just like it was when I was 30. And a lot of these influencers and people who sell these hormones kind of promote it like that. And that's
Yeah.
just not what it is. So you can't recreate the hormones of the past. It's too complicated. It's highly regulated by Mother Nature. But what you can do is treat your symptoms and live your best life with it.
Yes. Yes. I think that's so important. Like you said, it's nuanced, but it matters. It matters for our culture. It matters for our expectation. Just the attitude that we have going into this, I think it really matters for, for our population, especially where that is such a common practice, that we have like healthy expectations, and that our language even around it, I think it can really matter. So I appreciate that. Actually have a quote from you from the first one, that menopause is natural. It doesn't mean that you're going to wither on the vine. I love that. I think that is such a great way to look forward to things, or just deal with the experience and, optimize it the most that you can.
Yeah, you would be amazed at how people lose their minds when we call this a natural process. And it's like, I'm sorry, but it is. If every single woman on this planet with two X chromosomes, if she lives long enough, she's going to reach menopause. It's just like puberty. If you live long enough and you've got two X chromosomes, you're going to go through puberty. This is not something that is negotiable. This was programmed into us. But that doesn't mean you have to suffer through it. That doesn't mean that you have to, again, wither on the vine. It just means that, okay, this is the new landscape. This is what Mother Nature has programmed in me as a person with two X chromosomes. How are we going to deal with those changes? And if people are unwilling to accept that it's a natural phenomenon, then you're not going to be able to kick its ass. Okay, you got to know your opponent if you're going to win the fight. So, you have to know what it is. You have to accept it for what it is and say, all right, we know this is happening. We know bone density is going to decline. We know muscle mass is going to decline. Let's roll up our sleeves and figure out how we mitigate that.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's fantastic. So thank you. Thank you for recapping that and kind of getting us on the same page for expectations and just what an endocrinologist does. Since our mission is so focused on empowerment, connecting women, providing education, I actually wanted to start with some self-advocacy notes, because that seems to be something that we run into, where we go to providers and maybe they either don't understand the extremes that we've been through with a prep, or they don't understand I don't want to say that a lifestyle athlete is extreme, but they don't understand quite the mindset of some of the people who are in our community. And I think that's really important. So can you speak to when somebody goes to a practitioner and they say, hey, my energy's stalling. I'm 35, my energy's stalling. I've been through a few preps. I lost my period for that time. I had these symptoms. I just want to check in and see if everything's okay. And we get dismissed sometimes. So would you mind speaking to what we can do to handle that situation.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that when physicians don't know the answer to things, oftentimes those concerns get dismissed because I'll tell you, I'll be honest with you, until I started working with athletes, I didn't know what low energy availability was. I didn't know what fueling balance was, not until I started working with athletes. And that was well beyond my OBGYN residency. It was well beyond my training as a reproductive endocrinologist. Like I said, it wasn't until about over a decade ago that I really understood what this was. So when an athlete, even an avid recreational athlete,
Mhm.
comes, to the doctor, they don't know to ask the right questions because they know nothing about that world. And
Right.
I think that's the reason for the dismissal, is that they just don't know what to do with it. And I mean, even if we talk about the general population of menopausal women, there are so many practitioners out there that really don't know a lot about menopause. And they do the same thing. They will dismiss the concerns. So even in the non-athlete population, menopausal women, perimenopausal women are getting dismissed because their doctors just simply don't have the expertise in the area. So I think that's the reason it's happening. So how do we combat that? Well, we can't give these people a crash course. So what you really have to do is we have to do our homework and really seek out providers who are either menopause informed or athlete informed. And I think the most athlete informed clinicians out there are probably the sports medicine docs. Now,
Okay.
sports medicine doc isn't going to do your pap smear. They
Yeah.
probably haven't seen a speculum in there, in 20 years. So what does one do then? There is a growing network of clinicians who are informed about athletes. If you go to the CrossFit Medical Society, we have a directory of physicians in all specialties who are knowledgeable about athletes of all types. There is another practice out there that I consult for called Wild Health. Wild Health is a collection of docs, and many of them are actual CrossFit Games athletes and elite
Cool.
athletes themselves. A lot of functional medicine docs are, again, athletes themselves, or they tend to take care of athletes. So they're out there. You just have to seek them out because the general population of docs just they don't know anything about even the recreational athlete arena. It's really unfortunate.
And it's really smart to look into the virtual community because you do telehealth. We were talking earlier about how you do coaching if you might not be licensed in the state with somebody. So I think that's really important for people to know that as traditional as it may feel to go to your primary and get those answers from that go-to person, they just might not be able to help you with this. They just might not have the right background.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely true. But what I can say about the generalists though, at least the ones that work with the clients that I work with, they
Mhm.
are very receptive to other people's expertise. So like what I'll do for a client that I'm seeing who I can't be their physician because they don't live in a state that I'm licensed in, I will make a visit note that's very detailed with recommendations and whatever. They print that out, they take that to their PCP, and oftentimes the PCP is delighted that there is someone else
Yes.
who knows something about this. They can read it and see, okay, I think that sounds reasonable, let's do it. That is the response I get more often than not. So, there is definitely hope out there. These clinicians, although they may not know anything about that arena, they are receptive to other people who do.
I think that's a good note. I will say from my perspective, not being a medical doctor, that they're receptive to medical doctors. They don't really want to hear my bodybuilding coach said this or my
Right.
macro coach said yes or
Yep.
WebMD told me this. So I think that there's so much value in even just getting a consult and getting some guidance from somebody who is a peer to your practitioner that they will respect and they'll move on that opinion because I mean, that could save you a lot of time, really.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's absolutely true.
Yes.
I'm an OBGYN, I'm an endocrinologist, I'm a menopause specialist. So, I have experience in areas where they don't, and I'm board certified in these things. So that does lend credibility, and oftentimes they do say, great, I'm happy for the help.
Good, good. And guys on the audience, let us know if you have any questions. Feel free to drop those in the chat. I'm going to keep us moving into some core questions, but I do want to mention too, before I forget, that Dr. Carla has a article, Just Deal With It is Not an Option. We're going to put this in the show notes. It kind of touches on this whole like getting started, self-advocacy, what to look for in the symptoms. So we'll make sure that we put that in the show notes for you as well. And then whenever we start getting into some of the core questions, I actually want to go off script a little bit. We have a big discussion in the community around women who prefer to stay natural, never supplement hormones, never do anything along those lines, versus people who will go right into that path. And I hate to say it like versus, but there does seem to be a bit of a divide there. Would you mind speaking to what people can do first from an optimization standpoint if they choose to stay natural? And correct me if I have verbiage that is not accurate for any of that.
Yeah, no, I think the verbiage is perfectly accurate. I mean, it's like anything else. There are some people who really don't like to take medications, and there are some people who do. Like myself. I mean, my head has to be ready to explode off my body before I take an Advil. That's just me. And it's not that I'm afraid to take medicine. It's just that I prefer not to take something if I don't absolutely need it. I have other ways of trying to get rid of a headache. And if that works, great. I don't have to pop pills. And I think a lot of people feel the same way about hormones. There is no medication out there that is free of risk. There's always risk, there's always side effects. And so what the decision is that people make is that, is the symptom that I'm experiencing worse than the side effects and complications of the therapy? And everybody's threshold of when the balance tips to, yeah, I'm going to take the therapy, everybody's a little bit different about where that threshold is. So I think people just need to know that, okay, if this gets really disruptive to your life and you feel like you're suffering and you've tried everything under the sun and it's not working, just know there are tools out there that can help. But I think everybody's threshold needs to be respected. And
Yeah.
that's the problem I have with so many influencers out there that say, you have to take hormone therapy. You're missing out on XYZ if you don't. You're going to die on the vine if you don't take it. It's simply not true. Everybody lives their best life in their own way. And so I think we have to have respect for people's thresholds because they're there for their own personal reasons. So it's just, I think, important to be informed as to what's out there, non-medical and medical. And so that's your toolbox. You go through the tools in the toolbox, and if it's not getting fixed with the tools you have, then you might want to explore something else. And that's really what
Absolutely.
it comes down to.
Would you mind expanding? You mentioned low energy availability earlier, and I think that is one of those great baseline foundational things that we can check off the box, check off to make sure that, as we start exploring other options. Could you expand on that and maybe some of the other foundational things that any woman may not be doing that could help optimize their hormones?
Yeah, I think the fueling thing, like I said, I can say that I see it in the majority of clients that I see, from the recreational level to the professional level. It's everywhere. And part of the reason why it's everywhere is because there has just been decades and decades, generations of toxic diet culture out there.
Mhm.
And it was very revealing to me when I read this article. It was the International Olympic Committee consensus statement on RED-S, relative energy deficiency in sport, which is an extreme form of LEA. This is what LEA becomes when it's severe and when it's persistent. And it comes with a lot of health problems, bone loss, fractures, things like that. And so there was a study that they cited that said, okay, in sedentary individuals, this is, what kind of caloric intake is needed for maintenance and growth. This caloric intake is needed for weight loss, and this caloric intake is needed for where it's the danger zone, where you just can't be below this. And this was in sedentary people. And so I decided, because I'm kind of a math geek, to say, okay, what would it be for a 130-pound woman with 20% body fat. That's pretty average. And that's me pretty much. It's
Mhm.
like, what would my caloric intake be? And to make a long story short, for maintenance and growth in a sedentary person, 130 pounds with 20% body fat, it's over 2,000 calories. And I look at it and I'm like, that can't be right. I mean, it is. And why do we think it can't be right? Because we are stuck on this 1,200 calories a day if you're going to lose weight or whatever. And it's so deeply ingrained in us that we can't fathom what we really truly need. And I think
Right,
even in the business, like I am and like many people are, you still can miss it because that toxic diet culture message is still running rampant. And it was really eye-opening to me that, wow, this is really what people need. And people just aren't getting it. People aren't getting it. So if the sedentary woman who's 130 pounds, 20% body fat needs 2,000 calories, what does the triathlete need who's training 10, 12 hours a week or
right,
15 hours a week? She needs probably double that or at least
right.
50% more than that. And I will tell you, they're not getting it.
Mhm.
So I think that's probably the most profound appreciation I've had for this fueling imbalance problem in the female athlete space when I read this article.
I agree. And I think it can't be stated enough for our audience. If you're trying to put on muscle, you need to be eating. And, our bodies adapt to those 1,200 calorie diets. So it's a process to come back up from that, reverse diet from that. But it can't be said enough. So I appreciate you going into that. I do want to make sure we get some questions from the group that have come in the past. And I'm going to dive into to some birth control questions. Let's
Sure.
see. If I have, does hormonal birth control block symptoms of low hormones?
Does it block symptoms of low hormones?
Like
So
mask them?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll answer it with what I'm speculating the person means. So if we're talking about low hormones, that might be somebody who lost their period for whatever reason. Maybe it was due to low energy availability, training imbalance, or maybe ovarian failure.
Hmm.
And yes, the birth control pill can mask that because what the birth control does is it gives you artificial bleeding cycles.
Hmm.
So when we are not on birth control pills and we're having our periods, those periods are happening as a result of ovulatory cycles. The egg gets released, pregnancy doesn't happen, and then, progesterone falls, you have a withdrawal bleed, and then the menstrual cycle starts again. When you're on the pill, you have a bleed every 3 weeks, but it's not because you're ovulating. It's because the hormones are just programmed to, when you go off the active pills for a week and you're on the sugar pills, you have no hormone, and when you have no hormone there, you're going to have a bleed.
Right.
So programmed bleeds, they are artificial. And so, yes, in many times they can mask ovarian failure. They can mask low energy availability. And that's what's dangerous about it is that someone's on the pill, they're getting their periods and they think everything is fine, but yet their body isn't getting fueled properly. They're getting injured, they're not recovering, and their performance is suffering.
And if it was a less extreme case where there wasn't ovarian failure or there wasn't anything extreme like that going on, I'm wondering because our community comes back to optimize, optimize, optimize. So
Mhm.
I think a lot of times people will come off of birth control just so that their body can be functioning as, as optimal as it can. So that may be the case with this person that was maybe not in an actual medical crisis. What would you say to people who are just taking birth control out of the equation because they want to further optimize their performance as a bodybuilder?
So, in terms of athletic performance in general, because I don't think these studies have been done specifically on physique athletes, it's a bit controversial, but there is a widespread suspicion that birth control pills can reduce athletic performance relative to one that is having natural period cycles. There is some evidence for this, but it's not completely solid and concrete. When the body is in its optimum state of adaptation or the potential for physical adaptation, which is really what fitness is, that's when your cycles are regular and your cycles are coming. Because Mother Nature gave us menstrual cycles to conceive and to have a child.
Right.
What Mother Nature also programmed in there is that when conditions are not favorable in the environment, those periods are going to shut off. So if there's a bear in the woods waiting to eat you, that's your fight or flight response. Your fight or flight response, your stress response shuts your periods off because that's not a time where you need to be where you should be getting pregnant. It's a poor environment that's stressful, and you may not be able to adapt to the changes of pregnancy. Same thing when there is not enough fuel in the environment. If there is a famine and there's no fuel coming in, the periods are going to shut off. And so why? Because when you're not getting enough fuel, you can't physically adapt to the profound changes of pregnancy. So this is what Mother Nature has programmed in. And instead of pregnancy as your physical challenge, let's think about athletics as your physical challenge. The same holds true. So when your periods are cycling regularly, you are in the prime optimal place for physical adaptation. And that's where fitness is. Bodybuilders are a little bit different because it's more of an aesthetic sport than it is a physical performance sport where you're
Fair.
lifting maximal weight, where you're running, your 2K row times. It's a different sort of competition. And so
Right.
I think it needs to be considered separately because honestly, and I know a little bit about the physique space because I've had many friends in there and I've taken care of many patients there, is that the time that you walk out on stage, you are probably depleted. You are performing best on stage when you are a bit depleted, because you're trying to shed all of that fat, all of the water. You're trying to be vascular, but you're trying to do it before you start to lose the size and the muscle, and that takes such careful timing. So you're actually in a more depleted state when you are at your prime on stage. So I think physique athletes are kind of in a different place, just like any other weight class athlete. I think fighters are probably similar.
Yes.
They are a bit depleted too, so that they can make weight and not, fight the guy that's twice their size.
Mhm.
So they have to find that balance too of being a little bit depleted and making the weight, but still being able to fight and being able to, perform. So I think physique athletes are kind of in a place of their own. And it's challenging because there isn't a lot of research out there just on physique athletes.
It is challenging, and it's pretty common for people to come off of birth control to optimize their performance. And I mean, depleted for sure. We have so many people who it. I hate to say it's common to normalize anything because you never know what someone's experience is going to be, but it's pretty common to lose your period a while before you're getting on stage because you have been so depleted for so long. So, physique athletes are really their own beast of challenges.
Yeah.
To come back to the question about birth control, how is there anything that somebody can do when they're coming off of birth control to balance their hormones once they pull that out of the equation and kind of get them to a more optimal state faster?
If we're talking about physique athletes, it's challenging because when you are in your last 6 weeks of your prep, you're you're starting in that depletion,
Hmm.
because you're trying to cut. You're trying to cut during that time. You're spending the time leading up to it, bulking, bulking, bulking to try to get that mass, and then you have to cut. And so, in order to cut, you get a bit depleted, and that is probably when people lose their periods, is in that time leading up. So it's unfortunate as a consequence of what the sport entails that you achieve a temporary imbalance of your hormones so that you can perform. Now, it's okay for that to happen on a temporary basis. This is called adaptive LEA, adaptive low energy availability. And what that means is that it's a short-term situation where you are depleted for the purpose of the demands of your sport, if you're a physique athlete or if you're a weight class fighter or other weight class athlete. But then after the event is over, after you have competed, then you bring the hormones back, you start fueling again and you get more into an equilibrium. And that's when things come back to normal. But it's very hard to stay balanced hormonally during during a competition like that, because the competition requires depletion to perform at your best. And that's
Right.
what's challenging about this type of sport.
Right. And guys, let us know if you have any other questions around birth control before we move on to the next topic. I did want to throw in there that people would probably remove birth control from the equation, not when they're in a prep. That would probably be an off-season thing. So as long as they're getting the right amount of nutrients in, is it typical to expect that their body will regulate itself on its own pretty naturally?
As long as the fueling equation is balanced, then
Mhm.
I think they'll come back online pretty quickly. The thing about birth control pills that I think is probably challenging for physique athletes is the water retention.
Yeah.
Whenever you're taking a synthetic progestin, there's always that risk of water retention. So that's what's challenging about being on birth control pills. And IUD is a really good form of birth control for athletes because it has minimal systemic absorption of the progestin. You've got no endogenous estrogen. You have no estrogen coming in that's suppressing the pituitary gland. So you are still having cycles, hormonal
Right.
cycles, but you're just not bleeding because you have the IUD in place. And it's an incredibly effective form of contraception. So that is usually my preferred or recommended contraceptive method for athletes. And it would be
Mhm.
great for physique athletes because they don't have to take that oral progestin that can cause all that bloating.
I'm glad that you went into that because that comes up a lot too. And I just saw something recently that I don't want to say that they're mandating it, but it's becoming more common to make the IUD procedure easier because that's something
Mhm.
that deters people as well, especially if they haven't had kids. That can be a
Yeah,
pretty gnarly procedure. So
yeah.
does that sound right? Can you speak to that, or is there something even people can do to advocate for themselves so when they go in for that procedure, their doctor is prepped to make sure it's as easy as possible?
It's typically an office procedure. There are different sized devices. So back in the day when I got my Mirena IUD, that's all there was. There was a copper IUD, which is really gnarly, and you've got the progestin IUD, which is the Mirena. That's all there was, and it was really hard for women who had never had a baby before, never carried a pregnancy to term, to accommodate that big that big IUD structure. And a lot of times, women would experience a lot of pain. It would get expulsed because the uterus just doesn't tolerate it. So the market came up with some smaller devices. We've got the Skyla and the Kylena. Those are two smaller devices than the Mirena and the Liletta. Those are the two very similar IUDs that are larger, and they have the most progestin in it. And the Kylena and the Skyla have a lower dose of progestin in it. So people can still achieve that, that thinning of the lining and amenorrhea during, or, lose their periods when they have the IUD, which is really great,
Mhm.
because who wants to have a period, for bleeding's sake? And it has less progestin in it. So you still don't have all that systemic absorption that you would have if you took an oral birth control. So if you've not carried a pregnancy before, you may ask your doctor about the Kylena and the Skyla because they're smaller, physically smaller devices. But if you've had a baby before, or you've carried a pregnancy to the third trimester, then the Mirena or the Liletta are two very good options. Because if you put a small one into a uterus that's had a baby in it, whether it's C-section, vaginal delivery, or whatever, it's gonna get expelled because it's small and the uterus is bigger in those
Right.
circumstances. If you've had a baby, Liletta, Mirena. If you haven't had a baby, Skyla, Kylena.
That's great. That's great to know. We do get a lot of questions around that. Let's see. We have if you have an IUD and you lose your cycle, do you still experience bloating since people sometimes get bloated from period symptoms right before the show? So,
Usually if the IUD has been in longer than 6 to 12 months, then you shouldn't be getting any more systemic absorption of it. When you're on the higher dosed IUDs, a lot of times there is some systemic absorption for about 6 months. But if you've had your IUD in for longer than that, then you shouldn't have any more systemic absorption, and therefore you should not have any bloating. So I
okay.
would probably say don't put a brand new IUD in within 6 months of a show.
That tracks. Makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, we'll keep what about the copper IUDs versus hormonal IUDs?
I mean, the copper IUD is really for contraception. That's the main reason for it. It can make periods more uncomfortable and it can make periods heavier. That was the first intrauterine device that came out, was the Paragard IUD. Um,
Paragard. Yeah.
yeah, and that's a copper IUD. And then the Mirena came after that. And the benefits of the Mirena are that it secretes a progestin, a synthetic progestin, locally to the uterus, and it thins out the lining, which makes it an inhabitable environment for an embryo. Typically, that's the goal. And it also is a foreign body in there. And the other benefit is because it thins the lining, you don't get a period. Some people are really uneasy about not getting a period. Other people are like, that's great. Sign me up,
Yeah.
because it can be, it can people have painful periods. That's also another indication for a Mirena IUD is if you have heavy painful periods, that Mirena IUD is a very effective treatment for that when it's not due to fibroids, polyps, or any structural problems. So that's really the difference. That progestin and the IUD makes all the difference in the world. And the Mirena IUD is just as effective a contraceptive method as the Paragard copper IUD.
Yeah. I think we could stay on birth control for hours. Birth control and even cycles, all things with that. But I'm gonna keep us moving forward. I'll keep an eye out for more questions coming in. But let's move into hormones and actual physique development, starting off with a very common question of can low testosterone affect muscle growth and performance?
This is a tough one because, one person's normal range or normal testosterone level might be someone else's, low hormone level. We see this a lot in men because if you look at the male normal range of testosterone, it ranges between 200 and 800. So if you've got a guy that is living his best life at around 500 or 600, and then, through whatever reasons, aging or whatever, he's now living at 200. He feels like ass. And he comes, he's like, I feel like shit. I can't perform. I'm whatever. And then we check his testosterone. It's like, well, it's 300. It's in the normal range. Well, it's not normal for him.
Mhm.
And he's miserable. Whereas some other guy, on 300 is doing great, because that's just his normal. In women, it's the same thing. So our normal range of testosterone is between basically 20 and 80. 80 is a little on the high side, but it's kind of the upper range of normal that you'll see in people. So if you've got a woman who's, living at 40 her whole life, and then, with perimenopause or menopause, she's dropping down to 20, she might feel like crap. Whereas another woman who's living normally at 20, 20 is going to be fine for her.
Mhm.
So, it's hard to, that complicates the equation when we're trying to figure out, well, what is normal and what is not, and what's testosterone going to help. Now, in terms of body composition, what we've known there was a really good study that was done that looked at various doses of testosterone and muscle strength, hypertrophy, and development. And what we found was that there really wasn't an appreciable change in lean muscle mass, strength, or power until those testosterone levels got up into the male range. So when you're like up in the hundreds, 200s, 300s, that's when you are seeing those differences. But when you are in the physiologic female range, and we often use testosterone for libido, sometimes for drive, you're not going to get the same body composition response as what you get when your testosterone is up in those higher ranges. When it's in those higher ranges, it's kind of like the Wild West. There isn't a lot of study out there on the safety of these high doses of hormones, of testosterone in women. There's also a greater incidence of side effects. You can get
Yeah.
pattern baldness, hair growth in places you don't want, enlargement of the clitoris, which is rare, but it happens. And also deepening of the voice, and that is an irreversible situation as well. So there's definitely some caveats if you're going to be taking testosterone at those levels to promote muscle growth and development.
We had a thread come up in the group not too long ago where some people were just dropping their testosterone ranges in there or their numbers, and my jaw was on the floor reading it. I could not believe how high people were, and I have to think it maybe kind of skewed bias towards people answering that were higher. Same thing
Yeah.
comes up when it's like, how much food are you eating? The people who are really high on food usually are pretty quick to share because it's kind of a I mean, it's great to have your food be that high and have great body composition. So it was really surprising. I guess what testosterone ranges would we need to? I guess I'll backtrack a little bit. If we are asking a doctor to do a panel for us, what are the tests that they should be running? What should we be looking for? Just big picture to get a sense of where we're at health wise.
I mean, what I would get an estradiol level. I would get a total testosterone level. Free testosterone doesn't help us much. It's not a very accurate assay. So instead, I would get a sex hormone binding globulin and then calculate the free androgen index from the total testosterone in the sex hormone binding globulin. There's an equation, a very simple equation you can use to do that. And that just gives you a more accurate sense of how much free, unbound testosterone is out there interacting with the
Interesting.
tissue. Yeah. But I usually like when I am treating women for usually libido issues in menopause with testosterone, I use the total testosterone to gauge the therapy to keep them in the safe range. But it's important to also get the sex hormone binding globulin because if that is super high, then it's mopping up all that free testosterone and keeping it from interacting with the tissues. So that kind of has to be navigated too, which is why I always get it.
Okay, that's great to know. What about thyroid? Because that can have an effect on everything as well, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, as a standard panel, like if somebody comes to me with fatigue, if someone comes to me with hot flashes, other symptoms, depression, I'll
Mhm.
always get a thyroid for that.
Okay.
It really
So,
depends what they're presenting to me with, if they're
yes.
presenting to me just wanting to know what their androgen state is, they're on testosterone and they just want to know where they are, then it's pretty focused. Do the estrogen because if you're on high doses of testosterone, that can be converted to estrogen in the peripheral tissue. So you kind of
Mhm.
want to know what that is. So that's why I would get an estrogen if someone was concerned about their testosterone situation. But if someone just comes to me, they're menopausal or whatever, they're having all kinds of symptoms, thyroid is always part of the equation of what I get. And I
Right.
usually, if they're like in their early 40s, I'll get the pituitary hormones too, because they could be going into early menopause, and that's really
Mhm.
the only way I can identify it. So it really depends on the situation.
Okay. I think a lot of people in our community, which is mostly it's Facebook, so it's 30s to 50s, like there's a pretty big range there. They would probably be coming in just to kind of check in and get a baseline and see where they're at with things so that they can monitor it on the backside of a prep or have a sense of where they're at or just find out is anything really holding me back on progress. So would that be a full sex hormone panel?
Depends on age. If they're menopausal, I wouldn't, because they're menopausal. The pituitary hormones are going to be where they're going to be. There's really nothing to do about that. Um, if lipids, cholesterol is really important, especially if you're taking hormones, especially if you are taking testosterone, because the testosterone can impact that, and so can hormone therapy. So you want to keep an eye on your lipids. That's your total cholesterol, HDL, LDL, ApoB, triglycerides. That's all really important. I would also get fasting blood sugar and a hemoglobin A1C, because a lot of times when people are on testosterone, they can develop insulin resistance or a pre-diabetic state. When you think about polycystic ovarian syndrome, that's like a natural syndrome where women are making too much androgen and testosterone in their bodies. And what happens there is that there's a lot of insulin resistance and prediabetes that goes along with that. So women are kind of sensitive to that. So when you're on testosterone and you're living in those higher ranges, that's really something you want to keep an eye on. So you want to get your fasting sugar and your A1C. And then, like I said, if they're taking testosterone, you want the total T and the sex hormone binding globulin. Thyroid's always part of the equation if you are just kind of wanting to check in. I mean, thyroid should be checked pretty routinely. Like once you're 35, you got to have it checked. And then if it's
Okay.
normal, every 3 to 5 years after that, because after 35 is when women start, when the incidence of thyroid disorder increases in women. So we want to make sure that we catch it. And if it needs to be treated, treat it. So it's pretty routine to get thyroid even in asymptomatic people.
Those baselines matter so much, and there's just so much good stuff here. As you saw, an entire page of questions that I know we're not going to get to. I've got to circle back to one thing you said at the very top. You mentioned for Caucasian women, the average age of menopause being, can you speak to that? Can you speak to that on other races as well?
Yeah, I'd have to look it up. I don't have the statistics in front of me. I think women of African descent go later, I
Mhm.
think. And I think Asians might go earlier. I'd have to double check. But there are studies out there that have stratified Caucasians, Africans, Latinos, and Asians. And I would have
Okay.
to go back to take a look. One thing I can say, especially about bone density loss,
Hmm.
blacks do the best out of all of us. They tend to hold on to their bone density much, much more so than Caucasians do. Caucasians and Asians have the toughest time.
Interesting.
Yeah, especially Asians because they tend to be genetically smaller people.
Hmm.
You don't see as much obesity in the Asian population. We're talking Chinese, Japanese, Korean,
Uh-huh.
Vietnamese, as compared to Asians from India. Um, they tend to have leaner body habituses, and that tends to correlate with lower bone density because adipose tissue holds on to estrogen. And so, typically people who carry more adipose tissue will carry more estrogen and their bones will be better off.
Right.
So you have a race of people who tend to be smaller, leaner people. And unfortunately, what goes along with that is more fragile bones.
Interesting. Okay. And I ask about the numbers and the age markers because I do think that there's a lot of people in the US who maybe don't have health insurance or maybe not working very closely with a primary who's guiding them to get these milestone checks. So I always think it's worth, okay, what's a number that we can have in the back of our head? Like you've said
Yeah.
before, if it's not broke, don't fix it, but it's good to have a number in the back of your head that maybe gives you an extra push to get in and look for that help and seek out a little bit more information on your body.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think the menopause world has done a decent job of looking at different statistics in different demographic groups of people. And
Mhm.
so, if whatever demographic group you belong to, you definitely want to take a look at that and see, where your genetic baseline is based on your demographic group and just be mindful of it.
Great. Guys, I'll keep an eye on the chat. Just reminding you, we're coming to the top of the hour, so make sure you're asking your questions, getting those in. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep grabbing questions that were asked previously. So let's go into PCOS.
Mhm.
Comes up all the time, inhibiting us from progress and just the other symptoms that come along with that. Can you speak to what people can look for to maybe monitor if they could be showing signs of PCOS in terms of their body shape, fat distribution, things like that, and then go into some of the limitations?
Yeah, I mean, polycystic ovarian syndrome or PCOS is a very broad spectrum disorder. You can have what I've always called soft call PCOS, where people, okay, they might have irregular periods, they might have a couple of hairs on their chin, and yep, that lands them the diagnosis, to people who have zero periods and have to shave their faces. It can be a very, very broad spectrum with extremes. And so basically, PCOS is when the body is producing more androgen or male hormone than it should be. And that overproduction of male hormone from the adrenal glands and the ovaries is interfering with menstrual cycle communication between your pituitary gland and your ovaries. So it's almost like interference. And so people don't have regular cycles because the hormones are imbalanced in this way. And this can lead to an increased risk of metabolic syndrome, which is high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and diabetes. Even people with lean PCOS, there's about 15 to 20% of people who are not obese who have polycystic ovarian syndrome, even they have an increased risk compared to people of similar body habitus of metabolic syndrome when you compare them to non-PCOS people. So that is something to always bear in mind if you have PCOS, is that you need to pay some special attention to those cardiovascular risk factors.
Yeah.
In terms of athletic performance, women with PCOS actually do quite well. You will see a higher proportion of Olympic athletes with PCOS because those extra androgens really make an impact on muscle performance. So Stacy Sims actually clued me into this. We were having a conversation because I'm doing a talk on something we were talking about, and she said, "Oh no, it actually helps improve performance, and that's why so many Olympic athletes have PCOS." So it can really help with athletic performance in some sports. But it certainly has health consequences. A lot of times people tend to carry more weight just because of this hormone imbalance, because insulin resistance also goes along with it. So you
Right.
can't, you don't manage glucose because of it. So it's an interesting disorder for sure.
It is. There's so much variation of PCOS, so it's hard to speak to it. I think that when it comes up in our community, a lot of times it is that insulin resistance and holding a little bit more body fat, especially in that abdomen area. Correct me if I'm misspeaking to any of
Mhm.
this. Kind of giving them more of that apple shape that can be indicative of PCOS. So that would be a big inhibitor for someone who's, if
Yeah.
it's not managed well, it could be an inhibitor for success in the sport.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if you can manage all of those other things, you can actually use it as an advantage in your sport.
Yeah, which is great. I think that's
Yeah,
so
right?
helpful for people to hear because it's something that could turn you off of the sport. But I mean, if you can get it under control, you've got a little bit of a secret weapon that, up your
Right.
sleeves. I think that's great.
Yeah.
What about cellulite? Is that more hormone related or a genetically predispositioned?
It's also it's a matter of, what causes cellulite. I mean, one of the things that we see in menopausal women is that, the declining estrogen impacts collagen.
Mhm.
And when collagen is impacted, the skin is impacted. It doesn't hold moisture as well, and skin can develop that kind of cellulite appearance. So that is one thing that happens as we age. In terms of cellulite in younger women, that's not necessarily hormonal. A lot of times there's genetic predispositions that we have of where we hold on to our body fat. Some women hang on to it from the waist down, other women are the complete opposite. And that is very genetically driven.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Good to know. Not always the answer we want to hear, but good to know.
Yeah.
I'm going to go through some of the other just kind of random questions that have come in over time. Can you talk about the different ways of administering hormones, whether it's pellets, injections, creams, things like that, the pros and cons of each?
So in terms of estrogen and progestin therapy, there are plenty of FDA-approved options that are bioidentical that are available. You've got oral contraceptive pills. They're not bioidentical, but it serves as very effective hormone therapy for perimenopausal women. For menopausal women, you have estradiol patches and oral micronized progesterone. You also have your progesterone IUDs. There is no need to go to a compounding pharmacy or have any crazy concoction made because they are no better than the FDA-approved options, which are often cheaper because they're covered by insurance, and they're tested for consistency, for purity, and there's oversight in manufacturing. So for
Okay.
estrogen progesterone therapy, there's no need to go to the compounded options. Testosterone is a different animal because there is no FDA approved product for women because there is no FDA approved indication for testosterone in women. Although there is lots of great safety data and efficacy data in menopausal women with libido issues, keeping them in that female physiologic range between 20 and 80 nanograms per deciliter, very effective, very safe.
Mhm.
In terms of how we achieve that, I like the transdermal creams that are compounded. I use a very trusted PCAB accredited compounding pharmacy that I've used for years, and I get my transdermal products that way. It's very easy to manage the dosing and to control it. The pellets, I am not a fan of pellets because you cannot control the doses. They stick the pellet in there, you get this huge surge of testosterone that takes you up into the
Yeah.
male range, and then it comes back down again. And I'm not sure how often people get the pellets. I don't know if it's once a month or once every 2 months or 2 weeks. I'm sure there's probably variation,
Right.
but you just can't control the doses as effectively. Um, Testosterone injections is not bioidentical testosterone. That's testosterone cypionate, and that we don't have a lot of evidence or study on the safety or efficacy of that in females. So I don't usually recommend that. The troches, when you take sublingual testosterone, it gets absorbed very quickly. And then once it's in the body, it gets degraded very quickly. So you
Hmm.
don't get a real steady state when you're taking it sublingual. So for all of those reasons, that's why I typically use the transdermal cream. I get really good efficacy and very good control over the doses so I can keep people safe.
Okay. Any cons to that that people should be aware of just to navigate and help them just have the best possible experience with transdermal creams?
Yeah, wash your hands after you use
Yeah.
it. Because do not touch your pets, your children, your husband, because it gets absorbed very, very effectively in the skin. So after you use it, you want to make sure that you wash your hands really, really good. That's probably the biggest con associated with the creams. Some people don't like creams, if they sweat a lot, they may not feel that it absorbs. It is a daily application, which is a con compared to a pellet or something else where you don't have to take it every day. But those are probably the biggest things that I can think of is just the need not to touch anyone or anything afterwards and the daily administration.
Keep those hormones to yourself. Wash those hands. All right. Do you have an opinion on the online hormone clinics? I think that being able to reach very qualified providers like yourself is a great thing about telemedicine, but there are more and more clinics that are popping up that people can go to. And I don't personally have experience with like what the in and out process is, but I imagine that you have some insights on that for those online clinics that will ship drugs to people and things like that. Can you speak to that, please?
So, what I'll say in general that people need to look out for that is a pattern that is seen in many of these clinics is they will insist that, okay, you have to have a compounded formulation of estrogen, progesterone, testosterone to go with your blood levels, and it's individualized. It is no better than the tested FDA approved less expensive products. So, like I mentioned before, you do not need compounded therapy for estrogen and progesterone because there's plenty of ways to get both. There's sprays, there's gels, there's oral, there's IUD, there's transdermal. There are so many ways to get these hormones in tested products. There's no need to do it otherwise. The other really disturbing trend I'm seeing is that women go to these clinics and they're going there for hot flashes. They're going there because they're longevity clinics and they go, okay, I want my hot flashes treated. These clinics are refusing to treat these women with estradiol because what they're telling them is, nope, we're just going to give you testosterone and we're going to give you high doses so that you get the peripheral conversion of estradiol, and that should give you what you need. This is way outside the standard of care. It has not been tested. It has not been endorsed by any menopausal society in North America or in Europe. And it's dangerous because it hasn't been tested. It requires that women live in the male range of these hormones. And so
Yeah.
this is a disturbing trend that I have been seeing. So if ladies, if you go to one of these clinics for hot flashes and they refuse to treat you with estradiol, turn the other way because that is not a safe place to be. So I haven't been to any of these clinics myself, but I know this is happening because women are coming to me after they've had terrible experiences at these clinics and telling me
Right.
what they've experienced. So that is what to be on the lookout for, is that they're going to take your money by doing all this compounded hocus pocus when it doesn't need to happen. And they're making money pumping the pellets and the high doses of testosterone in you. And by refusing estradiol therapy, I mean, that's just, in my opinion, negligent.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
not the standard of care.
And that's huge. I'm actually really glad that we covered that because that is a huge trend in our community. So I'm glad that you spoke to that and what they can look for. So I appreciate that. While we allow people the opportunity to drop any additional questions that they may have in, guys, I did my very best to cover your questions. There's so much that came in and there's so many things that come up in the group. Dr. Carla, would you please mind telling us where people can find you?
So my website is probably the best place to find me. It's www.drcarlad.com. You can also find me on Instagram at dr_Carla, CARLA_D. I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook. You can search me by name there.
Great. We'll put all of this in the show notes, guys. Make sure that you do check out her website. She has a fantastic blog, fantastic newsletter. Get signed up for all of those. And we will have the replay available on Spotify and YouTube next week. Dr. Carla, this was great. I love speaking with you. This is so much knowledge. I can't wait for our group to connect with it. And thank you for what you're doing for the community.
Oh, likewise, Chelsea. Thank you for having me.
Have a great day. Talk to you soon.
Take care.
Bye.